The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality. The hospital room was suffocatingly sterile, smelling intensely of bleach, iodine, and the stale institutional chicken broth sitting untouched on my rolling plastic tray. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead hummed like a dying insect, casting a sickly, pale glow over the bruised and battered skin of my arms. A thick IV needle dug ruthlessly into the back of my left hand, delivering a slow, agonizing drip of painkillers that barely took the edge off the agony radiating from my torso. I had just woken up from a grueling, emergency 8-hour surgery, a procedure that had quite literally dragged me back from the brink of death. Before they put me under, my mother, Eleanor, had stood at the foot of my bed. She had held my hand, shedding perfect, pristine crocodile tears, and promised me that the entire family would be right there in the waiting room the moment I opened my eyes. Because I was incapacitated, and because I had always been the reliable, financially stable workhorse of the family, I had made the ultimate, fatal mistake. I had given her temporary access to my primary emergency savings account to handle my massive medical deductibles and keep my mortgage afloat while I was under the knife. I slowly turned my heavy, aching head toward the vinyl guest chair in the corner of the room. It was completely, utterly empty. My mouth was dry as sandpaper. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers clumsily grasping my smartphone from the bedside table. I expected to see a flurry of worried texts, missed calls from my father, or maybe a sweet message from my younger sister, Chloe, the pampered, perpetually unemployed golden child of our family. Instead, the screen lit up with a barrage of social media notifications. Chloe had just gone live on Instagram. Confused and fighting through the fog of anesthesia, I tapped the notification. The screen instantly filled with blinding, golden Caribbean sunlight. The sound of crashing ocean waves and upbeat tropical music blared from my phone's tiny speakers. There, framed against the crystal-clear azure waters of the Bahamas, was my sister. She was wearing a brand-new designer silk swimsuit, holding a crystal flute filled with expensive, bubbling vintage champagne. "Cheers to the ultimate family healing journey!" Chloe squealed into the camera, spinning around to show off her surroundings. My blood ran completely cold. The camera panned to reveal the jaw-dropping, sprawling interior of the Royal Pinnacle Suite, the most expensive, exclusive VIP multi-room cabin on the Sovereign of the Seas luxury cruise liner. The suite featured imported marble floors, soaring floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, a private grand piano, and a massive teakwood balcony complete with a personal jacuzzi. Sitting on a velvet lounger in the background was my mother, Eleanor, receiving a hot stone massage from a private attendant, while my father puffed on a Cuban cigar, laughing uproariously. I couldn't breathe. The monitor next to my bed began to beep faster. I dialed my mother's number. It rang 4 times before she finally answered, sounding incredibly annoyed by the interruption. "Look, we are about to head down to the captain's exclusive VIP dinner in 10 minutes. Can this wait?" She huffed, the clinking of fine silverware echoing in the background. "Where are you?" I croaked, my voice raw and broken. "And where is the $120,000 from my emergency medical fund?" My mother let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh. "Oh, stop being such a dramatic victim," she snapped, her tone dripping with dripping condescension. "You have insurance, don't you? The nurses will bring you ice chips. You'll survive. Chloe has been under immense emotional distress dealing with the burden of your sudden illness. We needed a family vacation to heal our auras. We used your little emergency fund to upgrade to the owner's suite. After all, family is an emergency. Stop being so utterly selfish and let us enjoy our peace for once in your miserable life." Before I could even formulate a syllable in response, the line went dead. She had hung up on me. In that exact moment, lying in a cold hospital bed completely alone, something deep inside of me permanently snapped. I didn't scream. I didn't cry a single tear. The fragile, pathetic illusion of family loyalty shattered into a million irreparable pieces, and in its place, a cold, calculating, and ruthless calm washed over me. They thought they had just robbed a weak, middle management pushover who would simply absorb the abuse like I always did. They had absolutely no idea that over the last 5 years, I had quietly built a massive, multi-million-dollar shell corporation. They didn't know I wasn't just some helpless patient. And they certainly didn't know that my holding company was the primary majority shareholder of the exact luxury cruise line they were currently sailing on. I slowly sat up, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs. I picked up my phone, bypassed my standard contacts, and opened an encrypted communication app. I made a single 2-minute phone call to the absolute highest tier of the International Maritime Command. 3 days later, as my family hosted a lavish, caviar-fueled cocktail party in their stolen VIP suite, the heavy mahogany door didn't just receive a polite knock. It was violently kicked open by... But before we watched the heavy, imported mahogany door of the Royal Pinnacle Suite splinter off its brass hinges, before we witnessed the exact, priceless moment the crystal champagne flute slips from my sister's perfectly manicured fingers and shatters across the immaculate marble floor. Before I tell you exactly how I orchestrated the complete and total financial, legal, and social annihilation of the people who left me to die while they drank vintage mimosas on my dime, we need to pause. I want to step out of that cold, sterile hospital room for a second and speak directly to you. Yes, you. The person watching this on your phone in the break room at work, or sitting in your car in the driveway because you need just 5 more minutes of peace before walking into a house full of chaos. Or lying in bed late at night, wondering why your absolute best is never, ever enough for the people who share your DNA. The illusion of family first. We need to have a very raw, very honest conversation about the biggest, most destructive lie that society shoves down our throats from the moment we are born. But they are your family. How many times have you heard that phrase? How many times has it been used as a weapon to guilt you into silent submission? Society conditions us to believe that sharing genetic material is the equivalent of signing a lifetime, irrevocable contract of servitude. We are told that blood is thicker than water, and therefore, we must tolerate endless disrespect, manipulation, and blatant financial abuse simply to keep the peace. But let me ask you this. Whose peace are you actually keeping? Because it certainly isn't yours. When you are the designated scapegoat of a toxic family, when you are the reliable, hardworking, responsible one, you aren't viewed as a daughter, a son, or a sibling. You are viewed as a utility. You are an appliance. You are a walking, breathing ATM machine meant to fund their delusions of grandeur. They expect you to set yourself on fire simply to keep them warm. And the moment you finally run out of fuel, or the moment you end up bleeding out on a surgical table fighting for your life, they don't stick around to help you heal. They take your wallet and book a first-class ticket to the Bahamas. The golden child and the scapegoat. If you grew up in a household like mine, you know exactly what I am talking about. You know the suffocating, crushing weight of the double standard, the golden child. You know what it's like to watch the golden child, the sister who refuses to work, the brother who drops out of life, the sibling who creates endless drama, be endlessly pampered, praised, and protected. They are handed the keys to the kingdom simply for breathing. Their failures are excused as finding themselves, while your monumental successes are ignored or worse, claimed by your parents as their own doing. The scapegoat. Meanwhile, you are expected to carry the world on your shoulders like Atlas. You pay the bills, you fix the disasters, you co-sign the loans. And what is your reward? Constant criticism, being told you are too sensitive or too dramatic when you politely ask for basic human decency. I gave my mother access to my emergency medical fund because, despite a lifetime of evidence to the contrary, the scared, inner child inside of me desperately wanted to believe that this time would be different. I wanted to believe that facing my own mortality would finally be the catalyst that made them love me. But narcissists do not possess the capacity for unconditional love. They only love what they can extract from you. It is time to audit your life. That moment in the hospital bed, staring at my sister's smug, sun-kissed face on my phone screen, wasn't just a betrayal. It was a brutal, beautiful awakening. It was the exact moment I realized that I was completely, wonderfully alone, and that being alone was infinitely safer than being surrounded by leeches. It was the moment I decided to audit my life. I looked at my family not as my blood, but as toxic liabilities. And in the world of high-stakes business, when a liability is bankrupting your enterprise, you do not coddle it. You do not negotiate with it. You liquidate it, without a single ounce of mercy. I stopped waiting for an apology I was never going to receive. I stopped playing the rigged game where the rules were constantly changing. I flipped the board over entirely. I took my power back, and I used the immense, hidden empire I had quietly built in the shadows to teach them a lesson that would echo through our family history for generations. Where are you watching from? So, I need to know who I am talking to today. I want you to go down into the comment section right now and tell me exactly where you are watching from. Are you tuning in from a small town in Texas? A busy subway in New York? A quiet apartment in London? Drop your city and state, or your country, in the comments below. Let's see how far this message is reaching. More importantly, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have ever had to look a toxic family member in the eye and say, enough. Hit subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you in order to protect yourself. Hit that like button if you have ever been the family punching bag, the financial crutch, or the silent scapegoat, and you are finally ready to step into your power and become the CEO of your own destiny. We are not just telling stories here. We are building an ironclad community of survivors, cycle breakers, and self-made titans who refuse to be victims anymore. We are a community that understands that true power lies in setting unbreakable boundaries and fiercely protecting our peace. Subscribe right now, because the revenge you are about to witness is a masterclass in justice. You will not want to miss a single second of how I legally, systematically, and ruthlessly dismantled my family's fake, caviar-fueled reality. Now, let's go back to the sovereign of the seas. Let's go back to that heavy mahogany door, because room service has officially arrived. To truly understand the absolute magnitude of the hellfire I was about to rain down upon my family's stolen tropical vacation, you have to understand the deeply toxic ecosystem that bred their breathtaking audacity. You have to understand how a mother, a father, and a sister could justify leaving their own flesh and blood bleeding out in a sterile post-op ward to go sip vintage Dom Perignon on the open ocean. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment on their part. This was the culmination of 30 years of deeply ingrained, parasitic family conditioning. The facade of the perfect family. I grew up in an affluent, aggressively manicured suburb of Connecticut, where the size of your front lawn and the brand of your imported SUV dictated your social worth. My parents, Eleanor and Richard, were the undisputed king and queen of keeping up appearances. To the outside world, to the members of the exclusive Oakwood Country Club, and to their judgmental friends, we were the picture of American aristocratic perfection. My father wore custom-tailored Italian suits and boasted loudly about his investments at every cocktail party. My mother was a terrifyingly put-together woman whose entire existence revolved around hosting charity galas, maintaining her pristine blonde highlights, and ensuring that our family's public image was absolutely flawless. But my parents were drowning in a sea of secret debt. They were mortgaged to the absolute hilt. Their credit cards were perpetually maxed out to fund the country club dues, the luxury car leases, and the designer wardrobes required to maintain their fragile illusion of wealth. And in this terrifying house of cards, my sister and I were assigned two very specific, unchangeable roles. Chloe, the untouchable golden child. Chloe was the golden child. From the moment she was born, she was treated not as a human being, but as my parents' most prized, exquisite accessory. She was the beautiful, bubbly, outgoing daughter who perfectly reflected my mother's narcissistic need for external validation. Because of this, Chloe was exempt from the rules of reality. When she turned 16, my parents took out a second, crippling mortgage on the house just to buy her a brand new, cherry red Mercedes convertible, simply because a girl of her social standing couldn't be seen taking the bus. When she failed out of her expensive private university because she spent her tuition money on luxury handbags and weekend trips to Miami, my parents didn't reprimand her. Instead, my mother wept softly and blamed the professors for not understanding Chloe's unique, creative spirit. Chloe was never expected to get a job. She was never expected to lift a finger. Over the course of her 20s, my parents bankrolled a series of her utterly disastrous business ventures. There was the bespoke holistic candle company that hemorrhaged $50,000. There was the boutique PR firm that never signed a single client. And most recently, there was her influencer lifestyle brand, which consisted entirely of her traveling to exotic locations on my parents' and eventually my dime, taking heavily filtered photos of herself to impress strangers on the internet. In my family's twisted logic, Chloe was a delicate flower who needed to be shielded from the harsh realities of the world. Her failures were always someone else's fault. Her endless greed was simply having high standards, the designated beast of burden. Then there was me. If Chloe was the delicate flower, I was the heavy, rusted machinery grinding away in the dark basement to keep the entire estate powered. I was the designated scapegoat, the workhorse, the emotional punching bag, and eventually the family's primary utility. While Chloe received a luxury car at 16, I was handed a stack of college brochures and told, "You're smart, you'll figure it out. We simply don't have the liquid assets to help you right now." I worked 3 grueling jobs, waiting tables until 2 a.m., tutoring, and doing data entry, to claw my way through a dual-degree program in finance and corporate law. I graduated at the top of my class, covered in student debt, while my parents threw a lavish, catered party at the country club to celebrate Chloe finding herself after a month-long yoga retreat in Bali. I learned very early on that in my family, love was entirely transactional, and my only currency was my usefulness. If I complained, I was labeled jealous and difficult. If I asked for basic emotional support, my mother would let out her signature chilling sigh and say, "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. You've always been the strong one. You don't need us to coddle you." And because I was conditioned to believe that this was what family meant, I fell right into the trap. I wanted their love and approval so desperately that I became their savior, the silent bleeding. When my father's investments finally went belly up and the bank threatened to foreclose on the childhood home, who did they call, weeping in the middle of the night? Me. I was 25, working 100-hour weeks at a brutal investment banking firm, sleeping under my desk, and living on instant ramen. But I drained my meager savings to bail them out. When Chloe got sued by a vendor for $30,000 after defaulting on a massive launch party for one of her fake businesses, my mother showed up at my tiny apartment, crying hysterically. "It will ruin the family name! It will destroy her future! You have to help us, please! Family protects family!" So, I paid it. I always paid it. I became the silent, resentful pillar holding up their extravagant fake sky. To them, I was just a boring, high-earning mid-level manager with a penchant for saving. I drove a reliable 5-year-old sedan. I lived in a modest, unassuming townhouse. I wore standard, off-the-rack suits. I allowed them to mock my drab lifestyle at family dinners, sitting quietly while Chloe paraded around in $5,000 designer dresses that I had secretly paid the credit card bill for. I let them believe I was weak. I let them believe I was a pushover. I let them believe that my sole purpose in life was to absorb their financial catastrophes and keep their caviar and champagne charade afloat, the empire built in the shadows. But what my arrogant, parasitic family fundamentally failed to understand was that you cannot forge a blade in absolute, crushing darkness without it becoming razor sharp. While they were busy spending money they didn't have to impress people they didn't even like, I was aggressively, ruthlessly building an empire. I didn't just stay in mid-level management. I leveraged my degrees, my relentless work ethic, and my intimate understanding of distressed assets to quietly found my own private equity and holding firm. I didn't buy flashy cars. I bought commercial real estate. I didn't buy designer clothes. I bought majority stakes in distressed logistics companies, turned them around, and sold them for astronomical profits. I hid my immense wealth behind layers of ironclad LLCs and blind trusts. By the time I turned 30, I wasn't just a millionaire. I was a quiet, unassuming titan of industry with a net worth that would make the richest members of my parents' pathetic country club look like paupers. One of those distressed assets I had quietly acquired a controlling interest in 3 years prior was a struggling luxury maritime hospitality group. Specifically, the parent company that owned and operated the Sovereign of the Seas. I owned the very ground they were currently sailing on. My parents and my sister thought they had finally hit the jackpot when I got sick. When my appendix ruptured and complications led to a life-threatening abdominal infection, I had been rushed into emergency surgery. In a moment of absolute, terrifying vulnerability, heavily medicated and desperate for the comforting illusion of a mother's love, I had handed Eleanor the login to a specific checking account. I told her it was my emergency medical fund, a paltry $120,000 meant to cover my out-of-pocket maximums, private nursing care, and my mortgage for the next 6 months while I recovered. I had looked my mother in the eyes, fighting through a haze of fentanyl and agony, and said, "Please, just make sure the hospital bills are paid. And please, just be here when I wake up." She had smiled, a warm, perfectly manicured smile, kissed my forehead, and promised she wouldn't leave the building. Instead, she walked out of my hospital room, transferred every single penny of that $120,000 into her own account, packed her Louis Vuitton luggage, gathered my father and my deadbeat sister, and booked the most expensive, exclusive VIP suite on a luxury cruise line, leaving me entirely alone to face the possibility of death. They took my money to heal their auras. They thought they had outsmarted the boring, pathetic family mule one final time. They thought there would be zero consequences, because there had never been consequences before. But as I sat in that cold hospital bed, making that encrypted phone call to the Maritime Command Center, the boring, pathetic family mule officially died, and the CEO took the wheel. Back on the Sovereign of the Seas, my family was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic storm that was about to hit them. They were currently anchored off the pristine turquoise coast of a private Bahamian island, living out their ultimate caviar-fueled fantasy. Inside the Royal Pinnacle Suite, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive Cuban cigars and imported sea salt. My mother, Eleanor, had invited two wealthy couples from neighboring suites, people she had just met at the VIP casino lounge, to join them for a private, catered afternoon cocktail hour. She was in her element, holding a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon, laughing loudly and pretending to be a woman of immeasurable, generational wealth. My father was lounging on the massive teakwood balcony in a plush, monogrammed bathrobe, puffing on his cigar and boasting to his new acquaintances about his global real estate portfolio. Meanwhile, my sister Chloe was standing in front of the sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows, having her personal attendant adjust the lighting so she could record yet another insufferable Instagram live video to her followers. In the center of the room, an 80-inch OLED smart TV displayed a calming, high-definition tropical screensaver, while a private string quartet, hired specifically for their suite, played a soft, classical rendition of a pop song in the corner. It was the absolute zenith of their fake, narcissistic reality. Then, the music stopped. There was no polite knock. There was no room service attendant calling out. There was only the sharp, electronic beep of a master override keycard, followed instantly by the heavy, mechanical thud of the suite's solid mahogany door unlatching. The door was pushed open with such forceful authority that it hit the rubber doorstop with a violent smack, rattling the crystal glassware on the serving carts. Into the room marched four massive, broad-shouldered maritime security officers dressed in crisp, immaculate white and navy tactical uniforms. Their faces were entirely devoid of emotion. Following closely behind them was Captain Sterling, a hardened, decorated veteran of the seas who commanded the flagship vessel, and the ship's chief legal officer, carrying a sleek, silver tablet. The string quartet instantly stopped playing. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Eleanor's fake, practiced smile vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying glare of an entitled woman whose ego had just been bruised. She slammed her champagne flute down on the marble counter, the liquid splashing over the rim. "Excuse me!" my mother shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous suite. "What is the meaning of this? You do not just barge into the Royal Pinnacle Suite. We are VIPs. We paid over $100,000 for this room. I want every single one of you fired before dinner." Captain Sterling did not flinch. He didn't even look at her. He simply walked to the center of the room, picked up the suite's master remote control from the glass coffee table, and pointed it at the massive 80-inch TV. "I assure you, madam, nobody is being fired today," Captain Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute obedience. "Except, perhaps, you as our guests. The true owner of this suite would like a word." He pressed a button. The tropical screensaver vanished. The screen went pitch black for a split second before flickering to life with a crystal-clear, encrypted, live video feed. The wealthy guests my parents had invited over gasped. Chloe dropped her smartphone onto the marble floor with a sickening crack. My father choked on the thick smoke of his Cuban cigar, erupting into a violent fit of coughing. There, projected in massive, high-definition clarity for the entire room to see, was me. I was still sitting in my sterile hospital bed. The harsh fluorescent lights cast a stark, unforgiving glow on my pale skin. The thick IV tube was clearly visible, taped securely to the back of my hand, delivering my painkillers. The steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of my heart monitor echoed through the speakers of the Royal Pinnacle Suite, cutting through the silence like a metronome of impending doom. But despite the hospital gown, and despite the bruises on my arms, I did not look like a victim. I did not look like the weak, pathetic scapegoat they had left behind. I sat perfectly upright, my posture rigid, my eyes burning with a cold, terrifying, and absolute authority. I looked like a corporate executioner who had finally been let off the leash. "Hello, Mother," I said through the screen. My voice was calm, measured, and entirely stripped of any daughterly affection. It was a voice they had never heard before, the voice of a CEO. Eleanor's face drained of all color. She stammered, frantically looking between the giant screen and the stoic security officers. I don't understand. What is this? Why are you calling the ship? How did you hijack the television? This is completely inappropriate. We have guests." "You don't have guests, Eleanor," I corrected smoothly, "because this isn't your suite, and you didn't pay for it." "We absolutely did," my father suddenly roared, stepping in from the balcony, trying to salvage his pride in front of the strangers. "We used the Emergency Medical Trust Fund. You were unconscious and we needed to heal. We are authorized users." "No, Richard, you weren't," I said, addressing him by his first name for the first time in my life. The disrespect made him flinch physically. "The account you drained was legally structured as a restricted medical trust under Vanguard Holdings. By transferring $120,000 across state lines into a personal account while I was medically incapacitated, you didn't make a withdrawal. You committed wire fraud. Federal wire fraud. And because I am the sole trustee, I had my legal team flag the transaction the moment I woke up." Chloe started to cry, her perfect makeup running down her face. "You can't do that! We're your family! You're ruining my content trip!" "Your trip ended 10 minutes ago, Chloe," I replied coldly. "The bank has officially frozen your accounts. The $120,000 has been reversed, which means, as of this exact moment, you have absolutely zero funds to pay for the Royal Pinnacle Suite." Eleanor crossed her arms, her narcissistic rage bubbling over her fear. "Fine. So you canceled the payment. We'll just put it on our credit cards. I know the CEO of this cruise line. I will have you banned from ever sailing again." I let out a slow, dark chuckle that vibrated through the speakers. It was a sound devoid of any humor. "You don't know the CEO, Mother," I said softly, leaning closer to the camera. "But you're looking at her." The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the crashing of the ocean waves against the balcony. "Vanguard Holdings," I continued, savoring every single syllable, "is my private equity firm. 2 years ago, Vanguard Holdings purchased a 68% majority stake in Oceanic Luxury Lines, the exact parent company that owns the Sovereign of the Seas. I don't just work in finance, Eleanor. I own the board. I own the company." I paused, letting my eyes lock onto hers through the lens of the camera. "I own this ship." I watched as the absolute, crushing reality finally broke through my mother's thick armor of arrogance. Her knees buckled slightly. The wealthy guests they had invited over were already edging toward the door, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fraud taking place in front of them. I looked up at the screen, shifting my gaze away from my pathetic, trembling family, and looked directly at the ship's commander. "Captain Sterling," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "Yes, Madam Chairman," the captain replied instantly, standing at strict attention. "Execute Protocol 0, I ordered calmly. These 3 individuals are no longer VIP guests. They are unauthorized stowaways in possession of stolen property. Strip them of all privileges, evict them from my suite, and prepare them for immediate disembarkation. The transition from a high society cocktail party to a cold, clinical extraction was instantaneous and brutal. As soon as the word disembarkation left my lips, the 4 security officers moved with the synchronized precision of a SWAT team. My mother, Eleanor, didn't even have time to set down her second glass of stolen champagne. One officer took her by the elbow, firmly, but with a terrifyingly professional lack of emotion, and began guiding her toward the door. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as the realization of her social death began to set in. The wealthy acquaintances they had invited were already scuttling out of the suite like rats from a sinking ship, heads bowed to avoid the gaze of the security cameras. They didn't want to be associated with stowaways and fraudsters. "Madam," the officer said, his voice flat, "you have 60 seconds to grab your purse. All other luggage will be seized as collateral against the unpaid suite balance and the fraudulent wire transfer. You are being escorted to the holding area for immediate tender to the mainland." The eviction of the golden child. Chloe was having a full-blown meltdown. She was on her knees on the marble floor, frantically trying to scrape up her shattered smartphone, her designer silk swimsuit already stained with spilled mimosa. "My luggage! My followers!" she wailed. "I have 3 suitcases of Prada and Chanel in the bedroom. You can't take them. I need my outfits for the beach club tomorrow." The chief of security stepped over her as if she were a piece of discarded trash. "The beach club is no longer an option for you, Miss Chloe. Your VIP wristband has been deactivated." He reached down and with one swift motion, he snipped the gold-leafed VIP band from her wrist with a pair of heavy-duty shears. The tiny piece of plastic, the symbol of her unearned status, fell to the floor with a pathetic tink. "Please!" she sobbed, looking at the giant screen where I was still watching, my expression as unyielding as granite. "Tell them to stop! I'll do anything! I'll post a public apology!" "You'll do nothing, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing through the sweet sound system. "You've spent 30 years living in a wardrobe built by my labor. It's time you see what it's like to own nothing but the air in your lungs." The financial collapse. While my mother and sister were being physically handled, my father, Richard, was standing by the desk, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his Cuban cigar. He thought he could still negotiate. He was a man who believed every problem had a price tag. "Now listen here," he stammered, looking at Captain Sterling. "This is a family matter. My daughter she's clearly still under the influence of her medication. I have a business back in Connecticut. I can wire the funds by Monday. Let's just keep this quiet. We don't want a scene." "Your business, Richard," I interjected. "You mean the real estate firm that hasn't closed a deal in 18 months? The one that is currently 3 months behind on its office lease? The lease that is, coincidentally, held by a subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings." My father's jaw dropped. The cigar finally fell from his mouth, burning a hole in the expensive Persian rug. "I've spent the last 3 days, while you were at the buffet, having my legal team perform a full audit of your lives," I continued. "I didn't just stop the wire transfer for the cruise. I've initiated the foreclosure process on the family home. I've called in the personal loans I gifted you for Chloe's failed businesses. And since you used my name as a guarantor without my permission on your country club dues, I've had you permanently expelled from Oakwood." "I'm making you accountable," I corrected. "There's a difference." The walk of shame. The security officers didn't wait for them to process the news. They were marched out of the Royal Pinnacle Suite and into the main corridor. This was the most devastating part of the plan. I didn't have them taken through the service elevators. I had them escorted through the grand atrium, the heart of the ship, during the peak of the pre-dinner rush. Hundreds of wealthy passengers in tuxedos and evening gowns watched in stunned silence as the socialite of the year, Eleanor, and her investor husband were marched past the grand piano and the crystal waterfalls by 4 armed security guards. Chloe was still crying, her hair a bird's nest of tangles, clutching a cheap plastic bag the guards had given her to put her essentials in. They weren't being taken to a luxury launch. They were being put on a supply tender, a small utilitarian metal boat used for hauling trash and crates of vegetables, to be dropped off at the public dock of the nearest inhabited island. No luxury transport, no first-class flights home. As they were forced down the gangway, my mother turned back one last time, looking up at the ship's bridge, screaming at the top of her lungs, "You're a monster! We are your family! You can't do this to us!" The last thing she saw before the heavy steel doors of the ship hissed shut was the giant LED screen on the pool deck. It flickered from an advertisement for the spa to a single, high-definition image of me, sitting in my hospital bed, raising a simple plastic cup of water in a silent, final toast. The bank accounts were at 0. The house was gone. The reputation was ashes. For the first time in 30 years, the parasites had been successfully detached. And as the tender boat sputtered away into the dark Atlantic waters, carrying the 3 people who had left me to die, I finally felt the weight of the world lift off my chest. Justice wasn't just served. It was delivered via express courier. The monitor in my hospital room flickered to black. The rhythmic beep, beep, beep of my heart rate, once a frantic signal of survival, had settled into a slow, steady, and powerful cadence. The silence that followed the disconnection of the feed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of a 30-year burden. 2 hours later, I wasn't waiting for a nurse to wheel me out to the curb in a generic plastic chair. I didn't have to wait for a ride home that was never going to show up. Instead, the heavy double-swing doors of the surgical wing were held open by 2 of my own private security detail, men in charcoal gray suits who stood like statues of granite. I walked out under my own power. My steps were slow, yes. My body was still healing. But every footfall on the polished linoleum felt like a victory lap. I was dressed, not in a hospital gown, but in a tailored charcoal silk lounge set that cost more than my mother's entire wardrobe. A pair of oversized designer sunglasses shielded my eyes from the afternoon sun, which felt warmer and brighter than it ever had before. The ascent to the throne. Waiting at the hospital entrance was a matte black Rolls-Royce Phantom, its engine purring with the low, predatory hum of a beast at rest. My driver, a man who had been with my firm since the beginning, stepped out and opened the door with a silent, respectful nod. He didn't ask how I felt. He knew. As the car glided away from the hospital, the sterile world of white walls and bleach faded into the background. I watched it shrink in the rearview mirror, a monument to the old me who lived for the scraps of affection from people who didn't deserve my name. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the underground private garage of the Vespera Towers, the most exclusive residential skyscraper in the city. I bypassed the main lobby and took the private, keyed elevator directly to the 80th floor. The doors slid open with a soft, expensive hiss. I stepped out into my penthouse, and for a moment, I just stood there, letting the silence wash over me. The floors were vast expanses of white calicotta marble, veined with gold that shimmered under the afternoon light. Towering 20-foot floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree panoramic view of the entire skyline, the city below looking like a collection of toy blocks I could rearrange at will. A massive crystal chandelier, a custom-designed masterpiece of hand-blown glass, hung from the center of the vaulted ceiling, casting fractured rainbows across the room. There was no clutter here. No golden child's discarded shopping bags, no father's half-empty whiskey glasses, no mother's passive-aggressive post-it notes. It was a sanctuary of absolute, unyielding order, the final glimpse of the parasites. I walked over to the kitchen island, a single massive slab of black obsidian, and poured myself a glass of chilled, alkaline water. I tapped the screen of my personal tablet, which sat ready for me. A final report had been uploaded by Captain Sterling's team. There was a grainy, high-zoom photograph attached to the file. It showed the three of them, Eleanor, Richard, and Chloe, standing on a sun-scorched, dusty public pier in a remote part of the Bahamas. They were surrounded by a few plastic bags of essentials the security guards had let them keep. The contrast was staggering. My mother was sitting on a rusted metal bollard, her face buried in her hands. Her once perfect blonde hair frizzed into a chaotic mess by the salt air and humidity. My father was arguing with a local official who looked entirely unimpressed by his investor credentials. And Chloe was staring at her broken phone screen, looking like a ghost. There were no cameras here, no filters, no VIP lounges, just the blistering sun and the reality of their own insignificance. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They looked exactly like the people they had tried to make me feel I was for 3 decades. I didn't feel a surge of anger. I didn't feel the need to call them and gloat. I felt nothing. And that nothing was the greatest gift of all. They were no longer characters in my story. They had been edited out. The weight of freedom. I walked over to the edge of the penthouse, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of the window. Below me, the world was moving on. Thousands of people were fighting their own battles, chasing their own dreams. I thought about the girl who used to cry in the laundry room because her sister got a car and she got a lecture. I thought about the woman who worked 18-hour days while her parents mocked her boring life, all while they lived off her secret labor. I realized that the hospital bed hadn't been a place of weakness. It had been a cocoon. The parasites were gone. The debt was settled. The golden child was finally in the dark, and the beast of burden had finally put the world down. I reached out and pressed a button on the wall. The motorized silk curtains began to draw shut with a cinematic, slow-motion grace, gradually dimming the city lights until the penthouse was a cocoon of golden private warmth. I sat down in my Eames chair, picked up my phone, and did the one thing I had been waiting years to do. I didn't block them. Blocking implies you're still thinking about them. I simply deleted their contact information. I wiped the call logs. I scrubbed their names from my digital life until there was nothing left but a clean, empty slate. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of expensive sandalwood and total, absolute freedom. The walk-away wasn't just a physical exit from a cruise ship or a hospital. It was a walk away from the version of myself that needed them to love me. I was whole. I was powerful. And I was, finally, for the first time in my life, home. I stood there for a long time, watching the city lights of the skyline begin to twinkle like a million diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. The penthouse was silent, but it wasn't the lonely, hollow silence I had felt in that hospital room just 3 days ago. This was a heavy, rich, and earned silence. It was the sound of a life finally belonging to the person living it. As I looked out at the world, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the cruise ship eviction. It wasn't the foreclosure on the family home, or seeing my sister's influencer lifestyle evaporate into the salty Caribbean air. Those were just the necessary liquidations of a bankrupt partnership. The real victory was the internal shift. It was the moment I realized that for 30 years, I had been paying an emotional tax on a debt I never actually owed. The myth of blood loyalty. We need to talk about the moral of this story, because my story isn't unique. It's the story of every reliable child, every successful sibling, and every strong friend who has been conditioned to believe that their worth is measured by how much of themselves they can give away. Society has spent centuries polishing the phrase, "blood is thicker than water," into a weapon used to keep victims of domestic and emotional abuse in their place. They use it to tell you that you must tolerate the intolerable. They use it to suggest that because someone shares your DNA, they are entitled to a blank check. Not just for your money, but for your time, your mental health, and your very soul. But let me tell you the truth I learned while staring at a hospital ceiling. Blood does not equal a blank check. Family is a word that describes a bond of mutual respect, protection, and unconditional love. If the people in your life are only present when you are providing a service, if they view you as a utility, a safety net, or a punching bag, then they are not family. They are parasites wearing a familiar face. The audit of the soul. If you find yourself in the position I was in, the one carrying the weight for people who wouldn't even bring you a glass of water while you're recovering from surgery, you need to perform a ruthless audit of your life. In the world of business, we audit our portfolios to identify which assets are growing and which liabilities are dragging us down. Why don't we do the same for our personal lives? Identify the parasites. Who in your life only calls when they need a favor? Who makes you feel small so they can feel significant? Who claims your successes as their own, but vanishes the moment you are in the trenches? Set the boundary. A boundary is not an act of aggression. It is an act of self-preservation. It is a fence you build around your garden so the local wildlife doesn't trample your flowers. If someone gets angry at you for setting a boundary, it is the ultimate proof that the boundary was absolutely necessary. Liquidate the liability. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. You cannot build a future while you are still funding the delusions of people who want to keep you in the past. Sometimes the most family thing you can do is walk away and let them face the consequences of their own choices. To the scapegoats and the silent mules. I want to speak directly to the survivors out there, to the ones who were told they were too sensitive when they asked for respect, to the ones who were given a bus pass while their siblings were given luxury cars, to the ones who have spent their lives being the responsible one while their needs were consistently treated as an afterthought. Your strength is not a license for others to abuse you. Your success is not a communal pot for others to dip into. You have worked hard for what you have, whether that is financial wealth, emotional stability, or a peaceful home. You are the CEO of your own life, and you have the absolute, non-negotiable right to decide who gets a seat in your boardroom. Leaving them behind doesn't make you a monster. It makes you a pioneer. It means you are the one who finally broke the cycle of dysfunction. You are the one who decided that the family name wasn't worth the price of your own happiness. Final call to action. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that spark of recognition when I described the cold hospital room or the triumph of the walkaway, then I want you to do something for me right now. Share your story. Go down into the comments and tell us about your penthouse moment. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic relative? Have you ever had to say no to a family member who viewed you as a bank account? What was the moment you finally realized your worth? Your story might be the lifeline that someone else needs to read today to finally find the courage to walk away. Join the community. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We are building a community of independent, self-made, and unbreakable individuals. We don't just tell stories of revenge. We tell stories of justice, self-worth, and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit over toxicity. Like and share. Hit the like button if you believe that boundaries are a form of self-love. Share this video with one person in your life who is currently being drained by a toxic family dynamic. Be the voice that tells them they are allowed to leave. The sovereign of the seas is still sailing, but the people who tried to steal my life are standing on a dusty pier with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And me? I'm here. I'm whole. And I'm finally free. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset. Protect it with everything you have. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.